Europe at war. Hitler stunned Europe with the speed and efficiency of the German attack on Poland. His Blitzkrieg or lightning war used armored columns called panzer divisions, supported by airplanes. Each panzer division was a strike force of about 300 tanks, with accompanying forces and supplies. The forces of the Blitzkrieg broke quickly through Polish lines and encircled the bewildered Polish troops. Regular infantry units then moved in to hold the newly conquered territory. Within 4 weeks, Poland had surrendered. On September 28, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland. Hitler's early victories. After a winter of waiting, Hitler resumed the attack on April 9, 1940, with another Blitzkrieg against Denmark and Norway. 1 month later, Germany launched an attack on the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The main assault was through Luxembourg and the Ardennes forest. German Panzer Division broke through weak French defensive positions there and raced across northern France. French and British forces were taken by surprise. Anticipating a German attack, France had built a defense system called the Maginot Line along its border with Germany. The line was a series of concrete and steel fortifications armed with heavy artillery. The Germans, however, decided not to cross the Maginot Line. Instead, they went around it and attacked France from its borders with Belgium. By going around the Maginot Line, the Germans split the Allied armies, trapping French troops and the entire British army on the beaches of Dunkirk. Only by the heroic efforts of the Royal Navy and civilians in private boats did the British manage to evacuate 338,000 Allied, mostly British, troops. The French signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. German armies now occupied about 3/5 of France, and an authoritarian regime under German control was set up over the remaining of the territory. It was known as Vichy France and was led by an aged French hero of World War I, Marshal Henri Pétain. Germany was now in control of Western and Central Europe, but Britain has still not been defeated. In fact, after Dunkirk, the British resolve heightened. Especially helpful in rallying the British people were the stirring speeches of Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt denounced the aggressors, but the United States followed a strict policy of isolationism. A series of neutrality acts passed in the 1930s prevented the United States from taking sides or becoming involved in any European wars. Many Americans felt that the United States had been drawn into World War I due to economic involvement in Europe, and they wanted to prevent a recurrence. Roosevelt was convinced that the neutrality acts actually encouraged Axis aggression and were gradually relaxed as the United States supplied food, ships, planes, and weapons to Britain. The Battle of Britain. Hitler realized that an amphibious land-sea invasion of Britain could succeed only if Germany gained control of the air. At the beginning of August 1940, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched a major offensive. The German planes bombed British air and naval bases, harbors, communication centers, and war industries. The British fought back with determination. They were supported by an effective radar system that gave them early warnings of German attacks. Nevertheless, the British Air Force suffered critical losses. In September, in retaliation for a British attack on Berlin, Hitler ordered a shift in strategy. Instead of bombing military targets, the Luftwaffe began massive bombings of British cities. Hitler hoped in this way to break British morale. Instead, because military targets were not being hit, the British were able to rebuild their air strength quickly. Soon, the British Air Force was inflicting major losses on Luftwaffe bombers. Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. Attack on the Soviet Union. Although he had no desire for a two-front war, Hitler became convinced that Britain was remaining in the war only because it expected Soviet support. If the Soviet Union were smashed, Britain's last hope would be eliminated. Moreover, Hitler had convinced himself that the Soviet Union had a pitiful army and could be defeated quickly. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was scheduled for the spring of 1941, but the attack was delayed because of problems in the Balkans. Hitler had already gained the political cooperation of Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. However, the failure of Mussolini's invasion of Greece in 1940 exposed Hitler's southern flank to British air bases in Greece. To secure his Balkan flank, Hitler seized both Greece and Yugoslavia in April 1940. Reassured, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. He believed that the Russians would still be decisively defeated before the brutal winter weather set in. The massive attack stretched out along a front of 1,800 miles long. German troops advanced rapidly, capturing 2 million Russian soldiers. By November, one German army group had swept through the Ukraine. A second army was besieging the city of Leningrad, while a third approached within 25 miles of Moscow, the Soviet capital. An early winter and fierce Soviet resistance, however, halted the German advance. Certain of quick victory, the Germans had not planned for winter uniforms. For the first time in the war, German armies had been stopped. A counterattack in December 1941 by a Soviet army came as an ominous ending to the year for the Germans. Japan at war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The surprise attack damaged or destroyed more than 350 aircraft, damaged or sunk 18 ships, and killed or wounded more than 3,500 Americans. The same day, the Japanese attacked the Philippines and advanced on Malaya. Later, they invaded the Dutch East Indies and occupied several islands in the Pacific Ocean. By the spring of 1942, almost all of Southeast Asia and much of the Western Pacific had fallen to the Japanese. A triumphant Japan now declared the creation of a community of nations, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The entire region would now be under Japanese direction. Japan also announced its intention to liberate areas of Southeast Asia from Western colonial rule. For the moment, however, Japan needed the resources of the region for its war machine and treated the countries under its rule as conquered lands. Japanese policy was now largely dictated by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, formerly a general who, in the course of the war, became a virtual military dictator. Tojo had hoped that Japan's lightning strike at American bases would destroy the U.S. fleet in the Pacific. The Roosevelt administration, he thought, would now accept Japanese domination of the Pacific. But the Japanese miscalculated. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified American opinion and becoming involved in the war. The United States joined with European nations and nationalist China in a combined effort to defeat Japan. Believing American involvement in the Pacific would make the United States ineffective in the European theater of war, Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. As in World War I, another European conflict had turned into a global war. The Allies advanced. The entry of the United States into the war created a new coalition, the Grand Alliance. To overcome mutual suspicions, the three major allies, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, agreed to stress military operations and to ignore political differences. At the beginning of 1943, the Allies agreed to fight until the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, surrendered unconditionally, which required the Axis nations to surrender without any favorable condition. This cemented the Grand Alliance by making it nearly impossible for Hitler to divide his foes. The European theater. Defeat was far from Hitler's mind at the beginning of 1942, as Japanese forces advanced into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hitler and his allies continued fighting the war in Europe against Britain and the Soviet Union. Until late 1942, it seemed that the Germans might still prevail. In North Africa, German forces broke through the British defenses in Egypt and advanced towards Alexandria. A renewed German offensive in the Soviet Union led to the capture of the entire Crimea in the spring of 1942. However, by the fall of 1942, the war had turned against the Germans. The tide turns. In North Africa, British forces had stopped General Erwin Rommel's troops at El Alamein in the summer of 1942. The Germans then retreated back across the desert. In November 1942, British and American forces invaded French North Africa. They forced the Germans and Italian troops there to surrender in May 1943. On the Eastern Front, after the capture of the Crimea, Hitler's generals wanted him to concentrate on the Caucasus and its oil fields. Hitler, however, decided that Stalingrad, a major industrial center on the Volga River, should be taken first. In perhaps the most terrible battle of the war, between November 1942 and February 2, 1943, the Soviets launched a counterattack. The German troops were stopped and then encircled, and supply lines were cut off, all in frigid winter conditions. The Germans were forced to surrender at Stalingrad. The entire German Sixth Army, considered the best of the German troops, was lost. By February 1943, German forces in Russia were back to their positions of June 1942. By the spring, even Hitler knew that the Germans would not defeat the Soviet Union. The Asian theater. In 1942, the tide of battle in the East also changed dramatically. In the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7 and 8, 1942, American naval forces stopped the Japanese advance and saved Australia from being invaded. The turning point of the war in Asia came on June 4th at the Battle of Midway Island. U.S. planes destroyed 4 attacking Japanese aircraft carriers. The United States defeated the Japanese and Navy and established naval superiority in the Pacific. By the fall of 1942, Allied forces in Asia were gathering for 2 operations. One, commanded by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, would move into the Philippines through New Guinea and South Pacific Islands. The other would move across the Pacific with a combination of U.S. Army, Marine, and Navy attacks on Japanese-held islands. The policy called island hopping was to capture some Japanese-held islands and to bypass others to reach Japan. After engagements near the Solomon Islands from August to November 1942, Japanese fortunes began to fade.